The deposit hits at 6:47 a.m. on a Wednesday. You're in the break room at work, waiting for the coffee to finish cycling through the machine. The overhead light has been flickering for 3 weeks. Someone taped a note to the pot that says "Please clean" after use in block letters, and someone else has been ignoring it for just as long. You are standing in a room that smells like burnt coffee and dry erase markers, holding your phone, reading a number that is larger than your monthly take-home pay. You put the phone in your pocket. You pour the coffee. You go back to your desk. Nobody saw that. Nobody knows. The flickering light above the break room sink doesn't know. Your manager, who is already at his desk reviewing last quarter's performance metrics, doesn't know. The notification sits in your banking app like any other notification, indifferent to the fact that something just shifted. This is what crossing the threshold actually looks like. No letter, no ceremony, no moment your memory can frame cleanly and hang on a wall somewhere. Just a break room and bad lighting and a number on a screen that took 4.5 years to arrive. It started the way most things that matter start. Not with a plan. With a problem. You were 29. You had a stable job, a reasonable salary, and an unshakable awareness that the salary had a ceiling. You could see the ceiling from where you were sitting. You had done the math more than once. The raises were real but small. The promotions were possible but slow. The timeline between where you were and where you needed to be financially stretched out in front of you in a way that felt less like a road and more like a corridor with no windows. You weren't in crisis. That's important to understand. You weren't desperate, weren't behind on anything, weren't lying awake with a particular weight of debt pressing on your chest. You were fine. That was the problem. Fine is a maintenance state. Fine doesn't build anything. You started reading. Not casually, not the kind of reading where you skim an article and feel briefly informed and close the tab and forget about it. The kind of reading where you get 2 hours in and realize you haven't moved and the room has gotten dark around you. Books about dividend investing, about compounding, about the mechanics of a portfolio that paid you rather than simply grew. About the difference between a number on a screen that requires you to sell something to access it and a number that arrives in your account on a schedule, whether you're watching or not. The concept was not complicated. That was the first thing that surprised you. The execution was the hard part, but the idea itself fit on a single page. You buy shares of companies that distribute a portion of their earnings to shareholders. Those distributions arrive on a schedule. If you own enough shares of enough companies with enough reliability, those distributions eventually exceed what your employer pays you to show up 5 days a week. At that point, the math changes. Not your life, not yet, but the math. You opened a brokerage account on a Sunday afternoon. The interface was unremarkable. No fanfare, no orientation, no one to witness the beginning of something. You funded it with $4,200, which was what you had left after 3 months of aggressive cutting. No subscriptions you hadn't used in 30 days. No takeout during the week. No new clothes when the ones you had still fit. Just subtraction, applied carefully, until there was a number you could move. Your first dividend check was $11.40. It arrived on a Tuesday. You read it 3 times to make sure you hadn't misread a decimal point. You had not. $11.40. You made a note of it in a spreadsheet you kept on your laptop. Column A, date. Column B, amount. Column C, source. You saved the spreadsheet and closed the laptop and went to make dinner. That was the beginning. There is a specific kind of discipline required to do this that nobody talks about in the right terms. People call it patience, which is true but incomplete. Patience implies waiting. What this actually requires is something closer to sustained indifference to speed. You have to become genuinely uninterested in how fast it's growing and genuinely interested in whether it's growing correctly. The difference matters. Speed-focused investing is emotional. Correct-focused investing is structural. When you're watching a number go up, you're attached to the number. When you're watching the architecture, you're attached to the process, and the process doesn't panic when a sector rotates or a headline spooks a market. You built the portfolio around a simple filter. Companies with a history of paying dividends, and not just paying them, but increasing them. Year after year, through downturns, through contractions, through quarters where the rest of the market was performing poorly. The ones that had been doing this for 15, 20, 25 consecutive years. They weren't exciting. They never made headlines. They were the kinds of companies that made things people needed regardless of what the economy was doing. Consumer staples. Utilities. Healthcare infrastructure. Industrial businesses with contracts that ran on multi-year terms. Your coworker at the time, a sharp woman named Bridget who had an MBA and genuinely enjoyed talking about markets, asked you once what you were investing in.
You told her.
She nodded slowly in the way people nod when they're being polite about something they find underwhelming. Those are really slow growers, she said.
You agreed.
She moved on to telling you about a position she'd taken in a tech company that had tripled in 14 months. You listened and asked one question: what does it pay in dividends? It paid nothing. She looked at you like you'd asked the wrong question. Maybe you had, from her framework. From yours, it was the question that mattered.
You kept adding. Every month, without exception.
Some months the amount was smaller because something unexpected happened: a car repair, a medical bill, a friend's wedding that required a flight. Some months you added more than planned because you picked up extra work or found a line item you could cut further.
The amount varied. The consistency didn't.
The spreadsheet grew one row at a time. Year 2, the annual dividend income crossed $6,000. You remember noting this in the spreadsheet and then going to sleep. In the morning, you had a 7:30 meeting about a project timeline that had slipped 2 weeks. The meeting was 90 minutes and resolved nothing. Afterward, you sat back at your desk and thought about the $6,000, which worked out to roughly $500 a month. Your phone bill was $85. Your renter's insurance was $23. The dividends were covering both with room left over, and they would do that again next month, and the month after, and the month after that, without you doing a single thing differently. That's when the architecture started becoming visible to you. Not as an abstract idea, but as something physical you could trace. The $500 wasn't just a number. It was a structural piece of your monthly overhead that had been transferred from your labor to your portfolio. You didn't earn that $500 by showing up anywhere. It arrived because you had made decisions 2 years earlier that were still paying forward. The cause and the effect were separated by time, and that separation was the whole point.
You didn't celebrate. You reinvested the dividend.
By year 3, you had developed a routine that would look unremarkable to anyone watching it from the outside. You woke up, checked the portfolio not with anxiety but with the same low-grade attentiveness you'd give a garden you were tending. Not anxious about every individual plant, just oriented toward the overall condition. You were looking for anything that had changed in the underlying business fundamentals of what you held. A company cutting its dividend was a signal. A company raising its dividend for the 18th consecutive year was also a signal, but a different one. You were reading earnings summaries before work, not because they were exciting, but because understanding what you owned was part of the process. You drove a 2018 Civic with 74,000 miles and a small dent above the rear passenger wheel well from a parking lot incident that had never been worth the deductible to fix. You had not bought new furniture in 4 years. Your wardrobe was functional and invisible. When people at work mentioned weekend plans that involved significant spending, you listened and asked questions and contributed nothing that required explaining where your money went. They assumed you were saving for something, which was accurate. They assumed it was something conventional, a down payment, a vacation, a car upgrade. None of those assumptions required correction. The invisibility wasn't a performance of humility. Explaining what you were doing would have required managing other people's reactions to it. Some would be skeptical.
Some would want advice.
Some would want to borrow from an imagined version of the account they'd constructed in their heads. None of those conversations moved the portfolio forward. So you kept them from starting. Your older sister called you in October of year 3. Her name is Renata, and she is the kind of person who calls to check in rather than to extract something, which puts her in a small category of people you make real time for. She had been in a job she didn't like for 2 years longer than she'd planned, and she was talking about going back to school, a part-time program, something that would cost around $18,000 spread across 2 years. You knew before she finished the sentence that you could transfer that amount without it registering as more than a moderate line item in your quarterly summary. You had that capacity. The question was whether you should use it that way. You didn't say any of this out loud. You asked her about the program. What did the curriculum look like? What did employment outcomes look like for graduates? What was the alternative if she didn't go, and what would staying in the current role cost her over 5 years in terms of earning trajectory? You asked these questions genuinely, not to stall, but because you had learned by then that money given to a situation before the situation is fully understood by the person living it tends to soften the edges of a lesson that needed to be sharp. Over the following 3 weeks, you talked through it with her 4 more times. You helped her find a tuition reimbursement benefit from her employer that covered 40% of eligible coursework. You found a state-level workforce development grant she qualified for based on her field. By the time she had all of it assembled, the $18,000 program was going to cost her closer to $6,400 out of pocket spread across 2 years. She handled it herself. When she called to tell you she'd been accepted, she said you had helped her more than she could explain without sounding like she was exaggerating. You told her she had done the work. That was not modesty. It was an accurate description of what had happened. She had made the calls, submitted the applications, negotiated with HR, and built the financial case. You had just asked questions that pointed at things she hadn't looked at yet. That's a different kind of help, and it leaves the ownership in the right place. You still haven't told her what the portfolio looks like. That's not a secret you're keeping against her. It's a boundary you're maintaining for the quality of the relationship. Money has a way of re-weighting the dynamics between people who otherwise relate as equals. You prefer the dynamic you have. Year 4, the annual dividend income crossed $41,000. You noted it in the spreadsheet. Column A, column B, column C. You closed the laptop. You had a meeting in the morning. But this one sat with you differently than the others. $41,000 was not your full salary. You made $58,000 at the time before tax. But $41,000 was no longer a rounding error in the comparison. It was close enough to the main event that the main event was beginning to look different. Less like the structure your life ran on and more like a choice you were currently making that you could, at some point, make differently. You didn't quit. That's worth saying plainly. You didn't celebrate the number by doing the thing the narrative seems to be building toward. Leaving felt premature, because it was. The portfolio still needed continued contributions to keep growing. Your salary was still the fuel. But your relationship with that salary had changed. It was no longer the only thing standing between you and instability. The instability buffer was now distributed across multiple companies paying you on quarterly schedules, and none of them required you to perform well in a mid-year review to keep the arrangement intact. That is a different way to inhabit a Monday morning. Not carefree, not unbothered by the ordinary friction of work, but subtly unlocked from it. When your manager gave feedback you disagreed with, you said so clearly and without the thin layer of self-censorship that comes from knowing you cannot afford to lose this particular approval. When a project asked more of you than made sense, you said that too. The dynamic didn't become adversarial. It became honest, which is the thing professional relationships are supposed to be and rarely are when one party depends entirely on the other for their financial survival. People noticed something had shifted in how you carried yourself, though none of them named it correctly. Your manager told you once that you seemed less reactive than you used to be. A colleague said you seemed more settled. You thanked both of them without explaining the mechanism. The Wednesday at 6:47 a.m. was year 4, month 9. The deposit was $4,440, the quarterly distribution from the largest position in the portfolio, a company that had raised its dividend every year for 23 consecutive years and showed no structural reason to stop. It was the single largest quarterly payment you had received to that point. It exceeded your monthly take-home pay by $280. You read it in the break room. You poured the coffee. You went back to your desk. Later that afternoon, you sat in your car in the parking garage during lunch and did something you rarely did. You just sat with it. No phone, no podcast, no task to complete. You sat in a concrete garage in a 2018 Civic with a dented rear wheel well and let the fact of it exist without immediately converting it into a next step or a spreadsheet entry. You had imagined this moment would feel like arrival. The scene between before and after, visible and tactile. It didn't feel that way. It felt like Tuesday morning from the week before, except with a different number. The seat had the same slight lean to the left from years of highway miles. The parking garage smelled like exhaust and concrete and the specific stillness of a space no one is meant to linger in. The world had not rearranged itself to acknowledge the crossing of a threshold. What you felt instead was something quieter and more durable. Recognition. The architecture had done what you built it to do, not because of a single decision, but because of 54 months of identical decisions made in ordinary circumstances with no audience and no reward visible at the time. The $11.40 in year 1 and the $4,440 in year 4 came from the same habit, made over and over until the scale changed. The decision each time was just, do it again. There's a version of this story that ends with the dramatic exit. The resignation letter, the clearing of the desk, the walk to the parking lot as a free person while the fluorescent lights flicker behind you. That version is satisfying and available to you. The math now supports it. But you haven't done it yet. Not because you're afraid, and not because you love the job. Because leaving requires that the portfolio reach a level of income that covers not just your current expenses but the contributions that are still growing it. The system still needs fuel. The fuel currently has two sources, the portfolio's own reinvested dividends and your salary. Remove one and the compounding slows. The timeline to full independence extends. You know this the way you know which drain cleaner works on PVC versus galvanized pipe. It matters which one you use and when.
So you stay. For now.
But you stay differently than you did at year one. You stay as someone who has confirmed the architecture works, who has watched the proof accumulate row by row in a spreadsheet that started with an $11.40 entry and is now a document that takes a moment to scroll through. You stay as someone who has learned that the discipline required to build this is exactly the same discipline required to maintain it, and that the maintenance looks exactly as unimpressive from the outside as the building did. At the networking event last month, someone asked what you invested in. You said dividend stocks mostly, some index funds, pretty boring stuff. They nodded and turned to someone else. Their eyes had already moved towards something more interesting. You got a glass of water, talked to two people you'd actually wanted to talk to, and left before 8. On the drive home, you passed a strip mall with a laundromat you'd noticed before.
The lights were on.
It was a Tuesday night and there were cars in the lot. You made no mental note. Laundromats were not your architecture. Everyone's architecture is different. Yours was compounding distributions from companies that had been doing the same thing reliably for decades before you found them and would continue doing it long after you stopped watching. The Civic needed nothing. You drove it home anyway. The spreadsheet now has 54 rows of monthly entries and hundreds of individual transaction records. The most recent row, added this morning, reads, Wednesday. $4,440. Column C, Q3 distribution, position 1. You'll add the next row next month, and the one after that the month after. The process doesn't require a witness, a ceremony, or anyone in the break room or the parking garage to look up and take note. What it requires is exactly what it has always required. Another decision that looks identical to the last one, made in an ordinary moment, in an ordinary room, by a person nobody is currently watching.